I never carried a gun in my life, and the one time I truly wished I had, I found out I didn't need to. That was the autumn Sela's crane came down the Cinnabar Road into Coldwater, and a man who'd been breaking that town's back for 6 years discovered there was one thing in the world he was afraid of after all. I was the doctor there, Harlan Poole. I set bones and pulled teeth and buried more folks than I'd have liked in that dry basin, and if you'd asked me before that fall whether one quiet stranger could change the whole grain of a place, I'd have laughed at you. Towns don't change. They rot slow or they dry up fast, and Coldwater was doing a little of both. But I was there, and I saw it, and I'll tell it the way it happened, because I've never told it right, and I'm getting old enough now that I'd like to. You have to understand the Antler first. The Antler way station sat 4 miles out of town on the flats, where the Cinnabar Road ran its long straight line between the mountains and the border country. Stages stopped there to change teams and let passengers eat something and stretch their legs before the hard pull south. It should have been a small, honest business. Hay, horses, a plate of beans, a cot for a driver. But Boyd Renner ran it, and Boyd Renner made everything he touched into a kind of trap. He was a big man, soft going to fat in the middle but strong in the arms, with pale eyes that never quite lit on you and a way of smiling that made you check your pockets. He held the water rights on that stretch, which in a dry country is the same as holding a knife to a man's throat, only politer. He held paper on half the small outfits in the basin. He'd loan a man money in a lean spring and own his roof by the next one. And he'd learned, the way that kind of man always learns, that if you keep people just frightened enough and just tired enough, they'll do most of your cruelty for you and thank you for the wage. Della Coyne came to the Antler the year her husband died, and she never got out of it. Not until Crane. I knew Tom Coyne a little. He was a decent enough man, quiet, not much of a hand with money. He'd come west with a wagon and a wife and a boy of 4, and a head full of things he was going to build. He hired on with Renner to drive stage and do station work, and he took a small loan against his first year's wages to put a roof over Della and the boy in a little sodden plank house on the edge of Renner's land. Then a fever came through in the spring and took Tom in 9 days. I was there for the last of them. There wasn't a thing in my bag that would have helped, and I've made my peace with that as well as a man can. The morning after we put Tom in the ground, Renner rode out to the little house with a ledger under his arm. I wasn't there for that part. Della told me the shape of it later, once she trusted me enough. Renner sat at her table and opened his book and read her a column of figures, the loan, and the interest on the loan, and the interest on the interest, and charges for this and that, feed and lodging and a wagon Tom had supposedly damaged, until the number at the bottom was a thing no widow with a child could ever hope to pay. And then he closed the book and looked at her with those pale eyes and told her, kindly as you please, that he was a reasonable man. She could work it off. Cooking, washing, tending the station. He'd keep the boy fed. He'd let them stay in the house. And in a few years, if she was careful, she might come out clear. She was 29 years old and newly widowed, and 1,000 miles from anyone who loved her. And she believed him, because there was nobody to tell her different. That was the debt. I want to be plain about it now at the start because it matters to everything that came after. There was no debt, not the way Renner drew it. Tom's loan had been small and he'd nearly worked it off before the fever. The rest of that ledger was a lie Renner painted fresh the morning after the funeral, when the only witness to the truth was in the ground. He'd done it before to others. He'd learned that the grieving don't count, and the frightened don't ask, and a widow with a boy will bend her back a long, long time before she breaks. For 3 years she bent. I watched it happen, and I did what small things I could, and I am not proud of how small they were. I'd ride out to the Antler when the stage brought sickness through, or when one of Renner's hands got himself thrown or cut, and every time I went I'd see her. In the cookhouse before dawn with her hands in the washwater. At the long table serving drivers who wouldn't meet her eyes. Out at the well in the dark hauling up buckets because Renner wouldn't spend on a pump. She was thin, she'd been a full-figured young woman when Tom brought her west, and by the 3rd year the work had pared her down to cord and bone. But she never once let me see her weep, and she never once let that boy of hers, Toby, see her afraid. Toby was 7 that autumn. A serious, dark-eyed child who'd learned to be quiet the way children learn things they shouldn't have to. He'd sit in the corner of the cookhouse with a broken slate and a nub of chalk, and Della had taught him his letters herself, an hour at a time, stolen out of the little sleep she got. Whatever else Renner had taken, he hadn't taken that. She'd decided, somewhere in the long grind of it, that her boy would come out of that place able to read and reckon and stand up straight, and she spent herself down to nothing making it so. The town knew. That's the shameful part, and I'll not hide from it. Coldwater knew what Renner was and knew what he'd done to the coin widow, and Coldwater did nothing, because Renner held water and Renner held paper, and Renner had 2 or 3 hard men on his payroll who were happy to remind anybody who forgot. Sheriff we had was a tired old fellow named Deakins who decided years back that the way to keep his job was to have no opinions, and he kept it. The merchants tallied up who owed Renner what and stayed quiet. I was no braver than the rest. I told myself I was a doctor, that I healed bodies and left the rest to God and Sheriff Deakins, and I looked away, and I have carried that. So that was Coldwater, the day Silas Crane rode in. A dry town on a straight road, with a bully at the edge of it and a widow being worked to death, and every man in it, myself included, agreeing without ever saying so that this was simply how things were. I saw him ride in. I was on the porch of my office with my coffee, watching the road the way you do in a town where nothing happens, and he came down out of the north with the dust behind him, one man on a plain brown horse, leading a pack animal, riding slow the way a man rides who has nowhere he has to be. He was not a large man. That surprised me later, thinking back, for all the fear he'd come to carry. He was lean and a little below middle height, past 40, with gray coming into a dark beard and a face burned brown and lined by more weather than most men see. He wore his coat long and his hat low, and he sat that horse like he'd been born on it. What I noticed first, and what I've never forgotten, were his hands. He had still hands. Most men's hands are always doing something small, tapping, fidgeting, worrying at a rein. His were quiet. They rested. And a man whose hands are that quiet is a man who has learned, somewhere hard, to spend no motion he doesn't mean. He tied up in front of the Coldwater house, which was the closest thing we had to a hotel, a saloon with 4 rooms over it, run by a widow named Pearl who kept a clean place and a shotgun she'd used twice. He went in, and I went back to my coffee, and I didn't think much more about him, except that a stranger passing through was the most interesting thing to happen in a month. I found out who he was that evening, the way you find out things in a small town, sideways, in a whisper, wrong. I'd stepped into the Coldwater house for my supper, and the room had that particular hush a room gets when everyone in it is pretending not to look at one man. He was at a corner table with his back to the wall, eating slow, a cup of coffee at his elbow. And around the bar, low, the talk was going. "That's Crane," a freighter named Osler said, not as low as he thought. "Silas Crane. I seen him in Kearney once. He killed the Dobbs brothers in the street there, both of 'em, and neither one of 'em cleared leather." "Crane," another man said, and the name went around the room like cold water. I knew the name the way everybody knew it, the way you know the names in the penny stories and the barroom talk, half true and half made up. A man who'd been a lawman somewhere and a hired gun somewhere else, and had left a trail of graves either way. If you'd asked me that evening, I'd have told you Silas Crane was a killer, plain and simple, and that Coldwater would be well shut of him when the stage took him south. I was wrong about nearly all of it, but I want you to know I believed it then, because it makes what he did the more remarkable. He finished his supper and he sat there over his coffee, and he heard every word they said about him. You could tell he heard, the way his stillness deepened, and he never once looked up or answered. When he'd done, he set a coin on the table and went up the stairs, and the room let out a breath it had been holding. He might have gone on south 3 days later on the stage and been nothing to us, a story to tell, if he hadn't gone out to the Antler. But the stage he meant to take ran through the Antler to change teams, and the drivers laid over there, and a man waiting on the south stage had reason to ride out and see about his seat. That's the small hinge the whole thing turned on. He rode out to book his passage south, and he saw Della coin at the well. I know how it happened because he told me later, in the few words he ever gave to it, and because I saw the after of it with my own eyes. He rode into the Antler yard in the afternoon, and there was a commotion at the well. Renner was there and two of his hands and Della. She'd let a bucket go, the rope had burned through her hands and slipped, and the bucket had gone down and cracked, and Renner was standing over her about it, not hitting her. Renner was careful mostly about marks. He was standing over her with that book of his figures in his head, telling her in front of his men and the boy what the bucket would cost, and what her clumsiness cost, and adding it, out loud, to the number she could never pay, and telling her, in that soft, reasonable voice, that at the rate she was going the boy would be grown and gone before she saw the end of it, and maybe that was just as well, since a woman who couldn't hold a rope wasn't worth the feed. And Toby, 7 years old, had come out of the cookhouse and put himself between his mother and Renner, the way a small, brave animal will, and one of the hands had laughed and taken him by the collar and set him aside like a chair. Crane sat his horse at the edge of the yard and watched all of it. Nobody paid him mind. A stranger on a horse was nothing. He watched Renner finish, and watched Della gather herself up off the ground with her burned hands and her straight back, and watched her take the boy's hand and lead him inside without a word, without a tear, because she'd learned that tears cost too. And then Crane got down off his horse and went inside and asked for a room. For the week. He didn't take the south stage, he stayed. He came to me the next morning. That was our first real meeting. He walked into my office with his hat in his hand, a courtesy I hadn't expected, and he said, "You're the doctor." "I am." "The woman at the Antler, coin." He said it flat. "Her hands are burned, rope burn, and older than that, the kind that don't heal because they never get to. She won't have a doctor sent for. Renner won't pay for one, and she won't ask." He set some coins on my table, more than I'd have charged. "I'd take it kindly if you found a reason to ride out and see to her. Whatever it costs is on me, and she's not to know that part." I looked at him a while. Up close he wasn't what the barroom made him. His eyes were dark and steady, and there was something worn out at the back of them, some grief so old it had gone quiet, and I have seen that look on men, and it is not the look of a man who kills easy. It's the look of a man who has once and never got over it. "Mr. Crane," I said, "you understand what Boyd Renner is." "I've met the kind," he said. "He holds this whole basin by the throat. A man who crosses him tends to find his credit called or his water cut or worse. I don't say that to warn you off. I say it because I've watched that woman worked half to death for 3 years and done nothing about it. And I'd know before I ride out there whether you mean to do something, or whether you're just a soft-hearted man passing through who will leave her worse off for having hoped." It was the plainest thing I'd said out loud in 3 years, and I felt the shame of it in my own mouth as I said it. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "I don't make a habit of leaving things worse than I found them, not anymore." And that anymore told me most of what I'd ever learn about his past. "Ride out and see to her hands, doctor. Let me worry about the rest." So I rode out. I found Della in the cookhouse, and I told her a lie, that Renner had sent word a driver had a fever and I'd come to look, and while I was there I'd see to her hands as a matter of course, no charge. She saw through part of it, I think. She was too sharp not to. But she let me take her hands in mine, and God, the state of them. Burned across the palms, old scarring under new, the skin cracked at the knuckles from the wash water and the cold. I cleaned them and salved them and wrapped them, and I got a good look at the rest of her while I did, the thinness, the way she held one shoulder, the deep bruised tiredness under her eyes that no salve reaches. "You ought not to be doing this work," I said low. "I've a debt to pay, doctor," she said, "and a boy to feed while I pay it. So I'll do what work there is." She said it without bitterness. That was the thing about her that undid you a little. She wasn't broken and she wasn't hard. She'd simply set herself to endure a thing, and she was enduring it, and she'd have gone on enduring it until it killed her, because she didn't know there was any other choice. "Della," I said, "I don't know what made me use her name, but I did. Do you know the man staying at the house in town? Crane." Something moved behind her eyes. "He's spoken to me twice. Nothing much." She looked at her wrapped hands. "He carried the water for me yesterday morning. Renner's whole yard of hands walking past me every day for 3 years, and never one of them touched a bucket, and a stranger comes and carries the water and doesn't say 2 words about it." She said it wondering, like she couldn't quite make it fit. "Why would a man do that?" "I don't know that I can tell you," I said honestly, "but I don't think he means you any harm." "Men who don't mean harm," she said, "are as scarce out here as rain." And she took her boy's hand, for Toby had come to stand by her, watching me with those grave dark eyes, and she thanked me, and she went back to her work. I want to tell you how it went between them, Crane and Della, because it was the slowest, most careful thing I ever watched, and it was nothing like the stories. He didn't court her. A man like Renner would have called it courting and made it ugly, and there'd have been a price attached. Crane did the opposite. He simply helped in small ways without expecting a thing back, and he did it whether she thanked him or not, whether anyone saw or not. He stayed at the Antler that week, and then he paid Renner for a longer stay, room and board, cash on the barrel, and Renner took it because Renner never turned down money, and I don't think Renner understood yet what he'd let into his yard. Crane made himself quietly useful around the station. He was a hand with horses like I'd never seen. He could gentle a spoiled team in an afternoon, and Renner's teams were always half spoiled from bad handling, so the drivers started asking for the stock Crane had worked, and that was worth money to Renner, so Renner let him. And in the doing of it, Crane was always somewhere near the well when the water needed hauling, always near the woodpile when there was wood to split, always near the cookhouse door in the cold hours, and the work that had been crushing Della got a little lighter, an inch at a time, so slow that Renner didn't rightly notice it and Della couldn't rightly refuse it. I'd ride out every few days. I'd made it a habit now, and I'm glad of it because it means I saw the thing grow. I saw her start to talk to him. Just a word at first, then a few. I saw her let him carry the heavy bucket, then let him split the wood. Then, one cold morning, I saw her hand him a cup of coffee across the cookhouse table without his asking, and I saw him take it and say, "Obliged," and nothing more. And I saw the 2 of them sit a moment in the gray light not talking, and I tell you my throat closed up, because it was the first gentleness I'd seen in that yard in 3 years. Toby took to him before Della did. Children know. The boy started following Crane about the corrals, and Crane, who I'd have bet had no more use for a child than for a toothache, let him. He taught him to sit a horse. He whittled him a top out of a bit of pine. And one afternoon I came on the 2 of them at the corral fence, the man and the boy, and Toby had his broken slate, and Crane was frowning at it, and the boy was showing him his letters. The boy was teaching the man is what it was, and Crane was letting him, patient and grave, and when I understood it my eyes stung. Silas Crane could not read. He was a man of fearsome reputation who could not read his own name, and he sat there and let a widow's 7-year-old teach him his letters at a corral fence, and there was more courage in that than in any gunfight the penny books ever gave him. He told me a little of himself eventually, not much. He was a spare man with his own history, but I sat with him some evenings on the porch of the Coldwater house, and over time it came out in pieces. He had been a lawman. Years back in a cattle town up north, he'd worn a badge and been good at it, too good, the kind of good that gets a man a name he can't put down. And there'd been a night, he never gave me the whole of it, where he'd killed a man who needed killing, a bad man, but the killing had gone wrong somehow, and a boy had died too. Not by Crane's hand direct, but in the middle of it, a bystander, somebody's child. And Silas Crane had taken off his badge and hung up his guns and ridden away from that town, and never worn either since. I told myself I was doing good work, he said once, staring out at the dark road. Standing between the town and the wolves, and maybe I was. But a man gets to where the standing between is all he is, and then it's just the killing and he can't tell the difference anymore. I could shoot the trigger off a fly. It's the only thing I was ever truly good at, and it's a black thing to be good at, and it cost a child his life. He was quiet a while. I don't carry it loaded mostly these days. I keep it because a man alone on the road is a fool without one. But I set it down. I set it down and I meant it. And now, I said. He didn't answer that for a long time. Then he said, "There's a thing I know how to do, Doctor, stand in the way. It's about the only good thing that ever came of the bad thing I was." And I look at that yard out there and that woman and that boy, and I think maybe there's one more time worth standing in the way for, one that doesn't have to end in a grave. He turned his cup in his still hands. I'd like, before I'm done, to stand between somebody and the wolf and have it come out clean. Just once. I've thought about that many times since. A man spends his life good at a terrible thing, and all he wants at the end of it is to use it one time and have it come out clean. But wanting it clean and getting it clean are two different things, and Boyd Renner was not a man who let go of what he held. Renner had noticed by then he wasn't a fool. He'd noticed the stranger who paid cash and gentled his horses had made himself a fixture, and he'd noticed the widow's back had straightened a little, and he did not like it. A man like Renner runs on fear the way a lamp runs on oil, and he could feel his fear leaking out of that yard, and he moved to plug the leak the only way he knew. He came at Della first, because Della was who he could hurt. He raised the debt. Found new charges, the salve on her hands, if you can credit it. He'd learned somehow the doctoring wasn't free, and he added it to her book. My kindness turned into another link in her chain. He cut her rations and the boys. He gave her the worst of the work and stood over her while she did it. And he began in that soft voice to talk to the drivers, to his hands, where she could hear about the widow and the gunfighter, ugly talk. The kind meant to shame her into pulling away from the one bit of gentleness she'd found, and it worked the way that talk always works. Della, who had endured everything, could not endure being made dirty. She stopped taking Crane's help. She'd carry the heavy bucket herself with her burned hands rather than let him and give Renner's mouth another thing to say. She wouldn't look at him. And Toby, who couldn't understand why the man he'd come to love was suddenly held off at arm's length, took it hard, and that was the cruelest cut of all, and Renner knew it, and that was why he did it. I watched Crane through those days, and I saw what it cost him to do nothing. Because he did nothing, that's the part I have to make you understand. He didn't ride into that yard and settle Boyd Renner with a bullet, though God knows he could have, and half of Coldwater would have blessed him for it. He held still. He watched Della pull away, and he let her, because to do otherwise was to prove Renner's mouth right. He watched the boy grieve, and he bore it. He kept his hands quiet. "Why don't you just end him?" I said to him one night, angry, the way you get angry at the one decent man for not fixing what all the cowards left broken. "You could. You know you could. That yard would sleep sound, and so would half this basin." He looked at me a long moment. "That's the whole of it, Doctor," he said. "That's the thing I set down. If I ride out there and kill Boyd Renner, then I've told that boy, I've told him with my own hands that the way you fix a hard man is you kill him. And then I'm not standing between him and the wolf. I've just showed him how to be the wolf." He shook his head slow. "No, there's a right way to do this, and it's slower, and it might not work, and it scares me worse than any gunfight ever did. But if it comes out clean, it'll be worth 10 of the other kind. I'll not spend that boy's whole notion of the world to save myself a few weeks of patience." The right way, it turned out, was the ledger. Crane could not read, but Crane was not a fool, and he had understood something the rest of us who could read had never troubled to think about. The whole of Renner's power came out of a book. The debt was numbers in a ledger, and the ledger was a thing a man wrote, and a thing a man writes, another man can read and check and prove false. Renner's power wasn't the two hard men or even the water. It was that everybody believed the book, and if the book could be shown a lie, the whole of it came down. He came to me with it. He needed a man who could read and cipher and who'd known Tom Coyne and who'd stand up and say what he'd seen. He needed me, and I want to tell you I said yes at once, but I didn't. I sat in my office with the thing he was asking laid out on the table, and I felt the old fear, 3 years of it, the fear that had kept me and every other man in Coldwater looking the other way. Renner held paper on my office. He could ruin me. I was a coward, and I'd been a coward a long time, and it fit me comfortable. Crane watched me be afraid. He didn't push. He just said, quiet, "You wrapped her hands, doctor, when nobody else would. You've got the thing in you. You just quit using it, same as I quit using mine. I'm asking you to pick it back up. One time clean." And I don't know that any speech ever shamed and lifted me at once the way that one did. I picked it back up. It took us 3 weeks, careful and quiet. There was a young clerk at the freight office, a nervous fellow named Higgs who owed Renner and hated him for it, and Crane had gentled him the way he gentled everything. And Higgs, God bless his frightened soul, remembered that Renner banked his takings and his loan papers through the freight line strongbox, and that there were copies that Renner, being greedy and orderly both, kept a second set of his figures because he didn't trust the first. Higgs got us a look. And I sat down with the numbers, Tom Coyne's true loan and its true payments in Tom's own hand, and Renner's fresh-inked ledger drawn the morning after the funeral, and the thing was plain as day to anyone who could add. The debt was invented. Not exaggerated, invented, near whole. Tom had all but squared his loan before he died. Every figure Renner had ground into that woman's back for 3 years was a lie he'd painted onto a dead man's account. And there was more, because a man who will do it once will do it a dozen times, and Renner had. There were 4 other names in that basin carrying debts born the same way, a widow, a broken-legged rancher, 2 old men, all of them loaded up the same week they were too grieved or too hurt to check. Renner hadn't just robbed Della Coyne. He'd made a trade of it, and the proof was in his own careful second book, in his own hand, because he'd never once imagined a day when anyone in Coldwater would dare to read it. We took it to the circuit judge. That was the last piece, and Crane's idea, and the wisest thing in it. Not to Sheriff Deakins, who'd have warned Renner inside the hour. To the judge, who rode through every 6 weeks and had no debt to Boyd Renner and a great dislike, it turned out, of men who forged accounts. Crane rode 2 days to catch him on his circuit and put the whole of it before him, and the judge said he'd come to Coldwater on his next round and hold a hearing, and any man Renner had wronged could bring his paper. Which meant, and this is the part that still lifts my heart, that the thing was going to be done in the open, in the daylight, by the law, with a book instead of a bullet. Exactly the clean way Crane had wanted it, if only Boyd Renner would let it get that far. He didn't quite. A man like that never goes quiet. He got wind of it. Deakins wasn't the only leak in a small town, and the day before the judge was due, he moved to break the thing the only way he had left. He came for Crane. I was in the yard of the Antler that morning, and I thank God I was, because it means I saw it, all of it, and can tell you it true against the 10 wrong versions that got told after. It was a cold morning, the first hard frost of the fall, the flats white with it and the water in the trough skinned with ice. The south stage was in, changing teams, a driver and a couple of passengers stamping their feet by the cookhouse. Della was at the long table pouring coffee. Toby was in his corner with the slate. And Crane was at the far end of the table with a cup in front of him, his back to the wall the way he always sat, drinking his coffee slow. Renner came out of his office with his 2 hard men and a shotgun broke over his arm, and behind him, sweating and small, was Sheriff Deakins, who Renner had fetched to make it look like law. Renner had a paper in his hand. He'd had his own writ drawn up, some crooked thing, and he meant to have Crane run out of the basin as a troublemaker before the judge could come. And if Crane wouldn't go, well, there was the shotgun and there were his men, and there was a tame sheriff to call it self-defense after. He'd killed leaks before. He figured he could kill this one. He came to the head of the table, and he laid out his lie in that soft voice, loud enough for the passengers to hear, so there'd be witnesses to the version he wanted. That this Crane was a known killer, a gunfighter, a danger to the peace of the town, and that the sheriff here was empowered to remove him, and that Crane had best mount up and ride and be grateful he wasn't hung for the graves behind him. And here is the thing I have carried 30 years, and here is why I am telling you all of this. Silas Crane did not stand up. He did not go for a gun. I don't believe he was even wearing one that morning. It was in his roll on his horse where he kept it, set down. He sat right where he was at the end of the table, and he let Renner finish. And the whole yard held its breath, because we all knew the stories, and we all expected the man of blood to answer in blood. And Renner's hands had their hands near their guns, half hoping he would, because that was the ground they knew how to fight on. Crane looked at Renner a long moment. Then he looked down the table at Della, who had gone still with the coffee pot in her burned hands, and at the boy in the corner with his slate, watching, learning, the way children always are, what a man does when the wolf comes. And Crane set down his coffee. He set the cup down on the table, careful, without a sound, the way those quiet hands did everything, and he stood up slow, and he said one word. Enough. That was all, enough, and I swear to you the whole yard felt it land. You forged that woman's debt, Crane said, and his voice was not loud, but it carried the way a low voice carries when a room has gone dead silent to hear it. You forged it the morning after you put her husband in the ground when there was nobody left to say different. You've done it to 4 others in this basin. And you've got the proof of it in your own second book, in your own hand, in that office right there, because you were too greedy to trust your own first lie. He let that sit. Renner's face had gone a color I'd not seen on it. The judge'll be here tomorrow. Everybody you've robbed can bring their paper. And you can stand up in the daylight and answer for it like a man, or you can raise that scattergun right now in front of these witnesses and prove to every soul in this yard exactly what you are. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't have to. But you're not running me off, and you're not working this woman one more day. That's finished. I'm telling you, and I mean it. Enough. I have seen brave things done with guns. That was braver, and there wasn't a gun in his hand. Renner had a choice in that second, and you could see him make it. He could raise the shotgun. His men were ready. But Crane stood there unarmed and unafraid. And a man raising a gun on an unarmed man in front of a stage full of passengers and a doctor and a sheriff, with his crimes just named out loud and the judge a day away, that man hangs, and Renner knew it. All his life he'd run on other men's fear, and he looked into Crane and found no fear at all to run on, and that was the one thing in the world Boyd Renner had never learned to fight. And then the yard turned. That's the part that still puts a lump in my throat, because Renner looked around for the fear he was used to, and it wasn't there anymore. The stage driver had stepped back from him. The passengers were staring. Higgs, who'd ridden out that morning, God knows why, except that maybe he wanted to see it, said in his nervous voice, "It's true. The second book. I seen it." And old Deakins, the tame sheriff, looked at Boyd Renner and looked at the man standing quiet at the end of the table who just laid it all bare. And something moved in that tired old lawman that hadn't moved in years, and he unbroke his own thinking the way you unbreak a gun, and he said, "Boyd, give me the scattergun. We'll let the judge sort it like the man says," and he held out his hand. That was the moment it broke, not the word enough, though that was the crack in the dam. It was Deakins holding out his hand, a coward finding his spine because one man had shown him it could be found. Renner looked at the sheriff's open hand and at the ring of faces that weren't afraid of him anymore, and I watched the power go out of him like water out of a cracked jug. He'd never had anything but the fear. Take that, and he was just a soft, pale-eyed man with a shotgun he didn't dare fire. He gave up the gun. There wasn't anything else to do. The judge came the next day and it all came out. The forged books, the 5 wronged families, the whole rotten trade of it. Renner's debts against the coins and the others were struck void. Every one. Renner himself was bound over for the fraud and taken off to the county seat, and I heard he did time for it, though I never followed the man's road after he left ours. Some people you're just glad to see the back of. His water rights and his holdings got tangled up in the courts and eventually sold off honest, and the basin breathed easier than it had in years. Deacons kept his badge and, to my surprise, grew into it a little. A man who finds his spine late sometimes uses it hard to make up for lost time. And Della Coyne walked out of the Antler a free woman, owing no one anything, 3 years and more of her life stolen, and not a way in the world to get them back, but free, with her boy who could read, and her straight back that had never once bent all the way. I want to be careful about what came after, because it's the part the stories always get wrong, and it mattered more to me than all the rest. Crane did not sweep her up. He did not step into the empty place Renner left and set himself over her. He'd freed her, and the whole point of freeing a person is that they're free of you as much as anyone, and Silas Crane understood that in his bones. So when it was done, he went to her, hat in his hand, and he told her that she owed him nothing, that he'd taken nothing on and expected nothing back, and that there was honest work to be had in the basin now for a woman who wanted it, and a school starting in Coldwater that would want a woman who could already teach a boy his letters better than most, and that whatever she chose it free and clean, and he'd not stand in her light. And then he did the thing that told me what he truly was. He got ready to ride on. He'd have done it too. He told me so that last night on Pearl's porch. She spent 3 years with a man deciding her life for her, he said. I'll not be the second one to walk in and do it, even gentle. If there's to be anything, it has to be her walking toward it all the way of her own 2 feet. And if there isn't, then I've done the one clean thing I came to do, and that's enough, and I'll ride. He turned his cup in those still hands. It's the hardest thing I ever set myself to, Doctor, riding out. Harder than the standing in the way. He almost smiled. Turns out the leaving bee is the part that takes the most nerve. He packed his horse in the cold morning to go south. And I was there for that too, and I'm glad because I saw her come. She came down the Cinnabar Road on Renner's old buckboard that was hers now by the judge's order, with Toby beside her, and she pulled up in front of the Coldwater house where Crane stood cinching his pack, and she got down, and she stood in front of him in the frost with her healed hands and her straight back, and she said what she'd come to say. I didn't hear all of it. I've a doctor's manners, and I stepped off away, but I heard the shape of it, and I heard her voice, which had gone strong again in the week since Renner, and it was not the voice of a woman being rescued. It was the voice of a woman making a choice. You told me I was free to go any way I liked, she said, so I'm telling you the way I like. I've had a man decide my life. I'll not have another, and I don't want another, but I've watched you for 3 months now, Silas Crane, carry my water and split my wood and teach my boy to sit a horse and never once ask a thing of me, and I've watched you stand in front of Boyd Renner with no gun in your hand and put a stop to the thing that was killing me, and I've made up my own mind. She stood up straighter, if that was possible. I'm not coming to you because I owe you. I owe you nothing. You saw to that yourself. I'm coming to you because I choose to, free and clear of my own will. If you'll have a widow with a boy and a stubborn streak and no dowry but the 2 of us, then that's my answer. And if you won't, you'll tell me plain, and I'll drive back to town and start my school, and I'll be all right either way, because you gave me that too. And Silas Crane, feared gunfighter, killer of the Dobbs brothers, a man who'd faced down death in a dozen streets, stood in front of that widow with his hat in his hand and could not for a moment speak. When he did, all he said was, I'll have you. And then, because he was an honest man to the bone, I've got a black past, Della, and I can't read, and I'm not young. I know what you can't do, she said. I've seen what you can. My boy taught you your letters, and you let him, and any man who will let a child teach him a thing is a man I can build a life with. And she put out her healed hand, and he took it in his quiet one, and that was the whole of it. No grand words. Two people who'd each been alone in a hard country reaching out and taking hold. Toby was already running to him. They married that winter in the little church in Coldwater, and I stood up for Crane because he had no other soul to do it, and I have never been prouder of a thing I did. They took a small outfit at the edge of the basin, bought honest, with the buckboard sold and a bit of money Crane had put by from a life he was done with, and they made it into something. Della taught school 3 days a week. She was the finest teacher that town ever had, and half the letters in Coldwater got written by hands she'd trained. Crane broke horses, and men came from 2 counties to have him gentle their stock, because it turned out the thing he was truly best at wasn't the gun after all. It was making a frightened creature learn it was safe. He'd had it in him the whole time. He just hadn't known there was a use for it that didn't end in a grave. And Toby grew up. That serious, dark-eyed boy who'd learned too young to be quiet, he grew up straight and easy and unafraid, because he'd seen, at 7 years old in a frost-white yard, exactly what a good man does when the wolf comes. He doesn't reach for a gun. He sets down his coffee and he stands up and he says enough and he means it, and he lets the daylight and the law do the rest. That boy took over his father's horse work in time. He called Crane his father, and Crane never once corrected him, and I saw Crane's eyes when the boy first said it, and I'll not describe that here. Some things a man ought to keep. Silas Crane never wore his gun again. Kept it, I believe, in a trunk oiled and unloaded, the way a man keeps a thing he's made his peace with. He never needed it. He'd found the clean thing he'd been looking for his whole life, the one time standing in the way that came out right, that didn't cost a child, that built something instead of burying it. He got old on that little outfit with his wife and his boy, and in time, a girl of their own, and he died in his bed with Della's healed hand in his, which is more than the penny stories would ever have let a man like him have, and more than he'd ever have dared ask for. I'm an old man now, and I've outlived most of them, and I've had a long time to think on what I saw. And I've come to believe the bravest thing I ever witnessed wasn't a gunfight, and it wasn't even the word enough, though that word still rings in me 30 years on. It was a widow standing in the frost telling a good man she'd chosen him, free, of her own will, after everything had been taken from her. And it was that good man packing his horse to ride away rather than take one thing she hadn't freely given. They made her pay a debt that was never hers. For 3 years they ground her down over a lie. And in the end the man who freed her did it not with the gun he was famous for, but by setting his coffee down and standing up unarmed and saying one true word in the daylight, and then, harder still, by opening his hand and letting her walk to him or away, her whole self, her own choice at last. I never carried a gun in my life. I'm glad I lived to see the day it turned out I never had to.